No one would dispute the statement that the Avro Lancaster was the finest British heavy bomber of World War II. Few would argue with the premise that it was the most potent bomber on either side during the conflict. The main reason for the Lancaster's success was its capability to carry ever-increasing bomb loads without significant degradation of its performance or handling characteristics. The most impressive examples of this were the Grand Slam raids mounted during the closing months of World War II, when specially modified Lancasters carried the heaviest conventional bombs ever dropped. When Britain declared war on Germany on September 1, 1939, Bomber Command's previously prepared extensive plans were in disarray. They assumed that Germany would invade France and the Low Countries first. As it turned out, however, the full might of the German war machine was directed towards Poland. This scuppered Bomber Command's Western Air Plan 4. In this proposed scenario, the German supply lines would be bombed. Poland, at 700 miles, was way beyond the range of the aircraft then available to Bomber Command. The other major strategy, Western Air Plan 1, proposed the retaliatory bombing of German airfields. However, Hitler had issued strict instructions to the Luftwaffe not to attack British cities, an act which would have set this plan into motion. The only other option open to Bomber Command was to mount a strategic bombing campaign against German armaments factories and oil fields. But on the day that Poland was invaded, Franklin B. Roosevelt issued a statement appealing to all the nations involved not to attack civilian targets or installations that may contain civilians. Britain and France agreed immediately, and Germany followed suit 2 weeks later. Within a week, Hitler had flouted the agreement. He ordered the Luftwaffe to blitz Warsaw. Even this outrageous act failed to alter the British government's stance on bombing Germany. This policy was of some relief to the then Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, Air Chief Marshal Sir Ludlow Hewitt. Hewitt had always been sceptical of the RAF's ability to carry out such grandiose plans with the equipment that was then available. The Fairey Battle, for instance, the RAF's most numerous bomber with its single engine and maximum payload of 1,000 pounds, was woefully inadequate. The Bristol Blenheim, effective when introduced in 1937, could only carry 1,300 pounds of bombs, and with its light armament of 2 machine guns, was outmoded as a daytime bomber by the early part of the war. One of its contemporaries, the 2-engine Hamden, had a greater bomb weight capacity of 4,000 pounds, but its cruising speed at 155 miles per hour was slow. This, combined with its light armaments, would make it easy prey for German fighters. The Armstrong Whitley had an impressive payload of 5,500 pounds, but again its effectiveness would be reduced by its slow cruising speed and low ceiling altitude. The Vickers Wellington, on the other hand, would emerge to be the finest twin-engine bomber of the early war years. Its tough construction, good armament of 6 machine guns, 1,500-mile range, combined with its rugged reliability and its 4,500-pound bomb load, made it more than suitable to open the RAF's bombing offensive. Still wary of civilian targets, the RAF's first attacks were on German shipping. These daylight raids were met by heavy flak and fighter defences. British crews hadn't been sufficiently trained in anti-shipping operations, and the majority of their 500-pound bombs failed to hit their targets. In 1,861 sorties, 43 aircraft were lost with over 100 crew. On April the 9th, 1940, the Germans invaded Denmark and Norway. On April the 12th, Bomber Command mounted a raid on German shipping off Stavanger. 83 aircraft were involved. Because of the distance, British bombers were unescorted and suffered heavily in the face of strong opposition from enemy fighters and very heavy flak. In total, 10 aircraft were lost. For Bomber Command with limited resources, this rate of attrition was unacceptable. Wellingtons and Hamdens were withdrawn from daylight operations immediately. On May the 14th, with the German blitzing of Rotterdam, the self-imposed British government policy of not bombing the German mainland was rescinded. From now on, though, the offensive would be carried out by night. Before the war, an operational requirement directive was issued for a heavy bomber. In response to this, work began at Avro, Handley Page and Shorts. The switch to nighttime bombing, although initially drastically reducing Bomber Command's losses, had a profound impact on the strategic campaign's effectiveness. At this early stage, crews were inadequately trained for nighttime operations, and aircraft were insufficiently equipped with suitable navigational aids. In June 1941, the Air Ministry's Butt report concluded that only 1 in 10 bombers were getting within 5 miles of their target, and in less than favourable weather conditions, this level of accuracy could only be achieved by 1 in 15. As if this wasn't bad enough, losses were mounting as well. German night fighter defences were becoming ever more efficient. In a single raid on Berlin on November the 8th, 21 bombers were lost out of a force of 69. Although this level of attrition was extremely high, at this point in the war this was the only way Britain could strike back at Germany. The hopes of Bomber Command lay with the new generation of heavy bombers under development. The new radar and beam navigational aids were also a cause for some optimism. On February the 10th, 1941, the RAF took delivery of its first heavy bomber, the 31-ton Shorts Stirling. Unfortunately, the design of this 4-engine bomber was flawed. The wingspan had been kept to less than 100 feet to allow it to use the standard RAF hangar. This meant, though, that it had an operational ceiling of only 16,500 feet. Its other major weakness was that the main spar divided the bomb bay, limiting the ordnance that could be fitted in it. Handley Page's solution to the heavy bomber brief was the Halifax, delivered to the RAF in March 1941. This aircraft was capable of 260 miles an hour at an operational ceiling of 21,000 feet. Its bomb load, however, was slightly less than the Stirling. The third and by far the most successful of the RAF's heavy bombers was the Avro Lancaster. This aircraft made its maiden flight in October 1941. The success of the Lancaster, however, was born out of disaster. Avro's original concept was a twin-engined aircraft designed around a new power plant from Rolls-Royce, the 24-cylinder 1800 horsepower Vulture engine. Christened the Avro Manchester, the aircraft entered squadron service at the end of 1940. Intended to be a replacement for the Handley Page Hamden, it fell desperately short of expectations. The complex new engines were unreliable in the extreme and failed to produce their design power output. The losses due to engine failure exceeded those from enemy action. Unbelievably, this Jinx design also had an undercarriage that was prone to failure. In action, many Manchesters were lost when flak ruptured vulnerably positioned coolant pipes underneath the engines. Despite this bleak picture, Chadwick, the aircraft's chief designer, was confident that the basic airframe was sound. What was needed were reliable power plants. The tried and trusted Rolls-Royce Merlin was the obvious solution. Chadwick and his team set about redesigning the wing to accommodate 4 of these. The wingspan was increased to 120 feet, and alterations were made to the centre section and tailplane. Initially called the Manchester 3, the prototype trials were extremely promising. Test crews were immediately struck by the new aircraft's transformation. Renamed the Lancaster, it had a range of 1,730 miles, was capable of carrying 12,000 pounds of bombs with a top speed of 275 miles an hour at 15,000 feet. Its ceiling, though, was 24,500 feet. Mass production commenced at Avro's 2 sites in the northwest. The fuselage was built in sections at Chatterton and transported by road to Woodford, where final assembly took place. The complex construction involved 500,000 manufacturing processes, producing 55,000 component parts put together in 31 sub-assemblies by a force of 40,000 Avro workers. Later Lancasters were also produced in Canada by Victory Aircraft. The Lancaster's first operational sortie was on March the 10th, 1942. 2 weeks earlier, Sir Arthur Harris took over as head of Bomber Command. His appointment brought major changes in strategy. Bomber Command's new task was to destroy the will of the German people by the area bombing of their cities.
In entering the war, then the essential, in my view, is you must make sure that you win the war, and that a war is not generally fought by any Queensberry rules. As far as civilian men and women are concerned, I think it is questionable who is the villain of the piece. Is it the people, the civilians, the men and women that make the bombs, the aircraft, the shells, the bullets, etc., that are the villains, or is it the people that use them?
As the months wore on, increasing numbers of Lancasters became available. On May the 30th, Operation Millennium was staged. Cologne was pounded in the first 1,000 bomber raid. Approximately 1,500 tons of bombs were dropped, causing more damage in one night than all previous sorties on the city. Bad weather and the increasing efficiency of German night fighter squadrons meant that the following two 1,000 bomber raids were far less effective.
All the crew get in via the rear door. The forward members have to climb over two main spars with all the flying suits and clothing on to get to the front. A crew of 7, you've got a bomb aimer, a pilot, a navigator, a flight engineer, a wireless operator, a mid-upper gunner and a rear gunner. And I used to fly in the Fraser-Nash 50 mid-upper turret here, which is completely rotating, and because I was right on the top of the aircraft, I was the eyes of the aircraft and was responsible for searching so that we get out of the way of the Ju-88s and Messerschmitt 109s. Behind me is the rear gunner in a Fraser-Nash 20 turret with 4 Browning .303 machine guns. The ammunition for the rear gunner is from large tanks inside the fuselage, which are fed in on a sort of electrical servo feed railway line, bringing the belts up to each gun. I think the 303 air-cooled gun was the finest gun used in the last war. Believe it or not, each gun fires 1,150 rounds of ammunition per minute. So the rear gunner with 4 there has got quite an armory in the back. That on top of the fuselage is a large collar round the base of the turret, and if you look underneath the guns there are 2 arms with 2 little wheels, and when the turret's rotating, those wheels are going round the top of that collar, and if the guns are rotating depressed and still firing, the arms and the wheels is called a taboo mechanism, which lifts the guns up when you're firing and stops you from shooting down your own fins and rudders and the tips of your props.
The increasing losses were a major source of concern for Bomber Command. By the end of 1942, it had been calculated that out of 100 aircrew, only 13 would survive their obligatory tour of duty of 50 sorties. A year earlier, with only 164 night fighters and a crude detection and communication system, the Germans had managed to shoot down 422 British aircraft. By 1942, however, the night fighter force had been increased threefold and the control systems had been completely reorganized. German airspace was divided into a grid. Each square was monitored by 3 radar stations. The information they gathered was relayed to the night fighter pilot assigned to that zone.
People often say, well, were you afraid? I suppose you were in a way. There was a certain amount of tightness in the tummy a lot of the time, but I think when you think back, I mean, most of us were only about 19 or 20 at the time, and you don't think too much about these things at that time. You rather think it's something that happened to somebody else and not you. But of course we did practice all kinds of drills for abandoning the aircraft, for dealing with a fire if you got one and all that sort of thing. And when something's been drilled into you time and again, it's surprising if it happens, you do it automatically. Although you do see pictures of Lancasters with turrets underneath, there are actually gun turrets underneath. There were very few of these really in actual fact. And the fact of the matter was there was no one in the aircraft who could see directly underneath. So the night fighter pilot's favourite mode of attack really was to attack from underneath in a blind spot. And they had 2 methods. One, first of all, if they spotted a bomber, they would dive out of the way so that the gunners couldn't deflect the guns to get at him. It would pull up underneath and give the bomber a squirt from underneath, usually aiming between the engines where they knew the fuel tanks were. And later on they even fixed upward firing cannon, which they called a Schweiger music or slanting music. And these consisted of a pair of cannons pointing upward, almost vertically upwards. And all they had to do then really was to find an aircraft, get underneath it. And of course they were flying along at the same speed underneath it, it was almost impossible to miss. And many aircraft went down to this sort of attack without knowing actually what happened to them. They would obviously aim for the fuel tanks and not for the bomb bay, because if the bombs went off, well, it would probably take the fighter with it as well. So they were a bit reluctant to do that. This was the great problem. But of course that was liable to happen at any time. Really the gunners, and the usual way we operated as a crew, and I suppose others did, the pilot would take a quarter of the sky from the front out to his wingtip. The engineer would be keep looking out this side round to the other wingtip, and the 2 gunners who were at the mid-upper and rear positions would also take a quarter of the sky. So it was rather like a ship, and they would be keeping a damn good lookout. And I think it is a fact that the guns on the Lancaster were not really used very much. The most important job was for the gunners to keep a jolly good lookout and to tell the pilot if they saw anything. But if you saw an enemy aircraft and it didn't think it had seen you, you wouldn't fire at it, you would tell the pilot and he would try to get away, because if you fired your guns it gave your position away and probably you'd have more fighters come down on you. So really firing the guns was a last resort if you thought you were going to be attacked.
Their cannon-armed interceptors, mainly the Messerschmitt 110 and the Junkers 88Cs, were accurately vectored by ground controllers. Proficient pilots could shoot down up to 6 Lancasters a night. Bomber crews in their heavily laden aircraft rarely even saw their deadly attackers. In response, British bombers were routed in narrow streams to minimise the number of boxes through which they flew, and the number of night fighters in their way. Despite this, losses were still unacceptably high. Night fighters exploited the Lancaster's main weakness. The aircraft was armed with 8.303 machine guns, mounted in 3 power-operated turrets. These were designed to give protection from front, beam and rear attacks. There was no protection, however, for the aircraft's underside. It wasn't until July 1943 that an effective solution was found. Bombers dropped bundles of foil strips, known as window, to confuse the German radar.
They created a lot of spots and blips on the radar screens, and it made it almost impossible to pick out the aircraft or separate them from the tinsel strips. And this was something which, as soon as you approached the enemy territory, you'd sit on the step down in the nose there, and there was a little chute in the side of the nose, and you could, under these bundles of tinsel would probably be this deep, and we'd push this window out at about 2 bundles a minute for perhaps a couple of hours on end. And when you arrived at the target, the bomb aimer would have come down, so it got a bit congested. He would be in the nose as well, and he used to start up to about 5 bundles a minute with this window.
This proved to be effective, but not for long. The Luftwaffe modified their tactics again. They adopted a more flexible system, freelancing in the path of bomber streams, using aircraft equipped with onboard radar.
John Chatterton, farmer, still working, Lancaster pilot in 1943 to 46, and very proud to have a son who is following in my footsteps.
And I'm Flight Lieutenant Mike Chatterton, who's current day captain of Lancaster PA 474, one of the only 2 surviving airworthy Lancs, and of course I'm very proud to be following Father's footsteps. The way we taxi the aircraft is a combination of the rudders and the brake lever, and also power as well. When we're moving along just trying to keep straight, I can just make small adjustments left or right by putting on the rudder and then just operating the brake lever. That just operates a small amount of pressure through to that particular brake wheel, and so turns the aircraft either slightly left or right. If I want to make a more positive turn, or if I've got very little speed and therefore not much inertia, I can use differential power. So I advance the throttle on one side. Obviously that tends to turn the aircraft back, but part of the fun of that is that because the aircraft is moderately heavy, it's a fair bit of inertia, and it's a bit like riding a bike the first time. When you first see people taxiing, they tend to zigzag an awful lot because they put the power on, nothing much happens, they put a bit more power on, and all of a sudden the aircraft starts swinging that way, and they take the power off and it's too late, the aircraft's moving. So after a while you get to learn that either with the brakes or with the engine controls, if you need to turn a little bit, you put on a bit of power or you put on a bit of brake, and before you've actually seen any effect you actually take that off again, because you know the aircraft's going to respond slowly but surely. In the wartime the taxiways were probably about the same sort of width, but as you were flying throughout the winter as well as the summer, the grass obviously got very soggy as well, so I think there must have been a risk every so often that for the new guys who weren't too sure, with a great heavy bomb load, a bit more too much power, the risk of coming off the side of the taxiway, and if you got the aircraft bogged down, you'd be very popular, because we've probably got the rest of the squadron, or even another squadron as well, all stuck there, and either have to taxi around a different way or they'd have to come to a stop. These are nicely organised. It's quite a clever idea, so you actually can hold them all in one hand. If there were 4 across, obviously it'd be a job to hold them, so they've turned the outboard controls so they actually come in like that, and you can get them all in one hand, which is quite handy.
Beautiful design. On things like the Halifax, they were just straight legs like these pitch levers.
Yeah.
And you didn't have the beautiful feel of them, be able to wiggle them around if you want a bit more power on one side or the other. Because in my days, when we took off, because of the Lanc's tendency to swing to the left, we had to have this throttle well advanced, and the pilot would advance his throttles like this, with the engineer following behind,
Yeah.
until eventually the pilot was feeling a bit of control on the control surfaces and the tail coming up, and he'd hand over to the engineer, who would then bring them all up. Now, we had a gate at the end here. Will it hurt if I move these?
No, it's okay.
You can feel a spring-loaded gate. You could get a certain amount of boost going up to the gate, but on a short runway with a full bomb load, you had to go right through the gate to get your maximum power. The pilot tended to get most of the credit in a crew. I mean, if there was one person going to be decorated, it was usually the pilot that got it. But he did have a lot of responsibility. The other 6 men had all very important duties, but there are certain times in the aircraft when everything rested entirely on the pilot. Takeoff is probably the most important one, with a bomb load. When if the pilot made a mistake, the crew couldn't do anything about it at all. They were entirely in his hands. And I always remember my crew, or any other crew, how very trusting they must have been to sit there behind me, hoping I was going to do things right. And when you're flying along, it often was very, very boring. There were long periods on, say, an 8-hour trip when nothing much was happening at all, but you couldn't really relax because you never knew about the night fighters. They would steal up behind you in the early days and attack from the rear, and if the gunners were awake, you had a good chance of spotting them, especially the rear gunner, and you could probably then take some evasive action. The standard evasive action in 5 group, which was the group to the south of Lincolnshire, was the corkscrew. This was essentially a sudden diving turn and then rolling at the bottom and going in the opposite direction, and then climbing again, twisting from one side to the other and repeating the whole process. I was a bit worried about the corkscrew because I felt very vulnerable in the climbing phases. In the initial dive, when you were screaming downhill maximum speed, you had a feeling that you could outwit the man who was trying to tighten up behind you, because after all, if he's coming behind you, he's got to get his guns to bear in front of you, just like when you're shooting pheasants. You've got to be in front of them. And if you could make it more and more difficult for him to get his sights on you by diving and screaming away, then you had a good chance to get away. I'm sure that in the attacks that were made upon us, I invariably lost the fighter in that initial diving turn. Sometimes we went through the whole corkscrew, but as I say, on the climbing phases, when you're slowly going up and then rolling along like that, I'm sure if he sat back far enough with his cannon, he could easily shoot you, as long as he got the visibility, because on a really dark, mucky night, it was our advantage, of course. He probably wouldn't be able to find us. Then, of course, the Germans got some very clever radars, and they adopted a different system. And when these fighters came up underneath us with guns that were fitted to fire upwards, I don't think we'd got a chance at all. And so many people were just shot out of the sky, never knowing that they were being attacked. First thing that happened was a couple of cannon shells in the wing there, and the whole airplane on fire. Obviously, I never was attacked by Schlager music. I don't think I'd be here to tell the tale.
The conditions were not particularly good because there was very little heating in the aircraft. It was very cold, it was quite drafty, and people like the rear gunner were stuck out at the end and actually had a clear vision panel cut in the turret, so they were open to the open air and therefore extremely cold. It was therefore very necessary to talk to your crew quite often to make sure that they were awake and alert and looking for fighters so that you were not jumped upon. It was essential for your gunners to spot the fighter in sufficient time for you to carry out the corkscrew manoeuvres, which, if carried out correctly, made it fairly impossible for a fighter to shoot a Lancaster down. The Lancaster was very, very manoeuvrable. It could be stood on one wingtip and would corkscrew very, very well. It's so manoeuvrable that at least one of the test pilots of Avro would quite often slow roll a Lancaster after he'd put it through a test flight. I don't think you can get a better recommendation for manoeuvrability than that. I know from personal experience also that it was very, very manoeuvrable, although of course I did not try to do slow rolls with bomb loads on.
We were attacked by a Ju-88 over the sea, and the gunner spotted him, called out to the pilot to go to, I think it was corkscrew to port, and as the wings tilted, he fired at us, and he took about 2 feet off the top of the rudder and a chunk off the end of the wing, and that was the most damage we suffered. Fortunately, the rudders still worked and the ailerons still worked, so we were able to come home, and he only made one run at us. He obviously thought we'd spotted him and he was not going to chance his arm anymore. But that's a typical kind of attack.
For the beleaguered and battered forces of Bomber Command, the success of the Dambusters operation was a major morale booster. 19 specially adapted Lancasters carried the revolutionary Barnes-Wallis invention, the bouncing bomb. This was specially designed to breach German dams. The Manna, the Ida and the Sorper were the 3 dams chosen for Operation Chastise. Wallis predicted the destruction of these 3 targets, and the flooding that resulted would cripple the German industry in the Ruhr Valley. The Manna and the Ida were seriously damaged. The Sorper, however, still stood. Although not entirely successful, the raid epitomised the spirit of Britain's resolve. The versatility of the Lancaster was now beyond doubt. The standard Lancaster I had an unobstructed bomb bay measuring 33 by 5 feet. One of the most devastating assortments of ordnance was one 8,000 and 6 500-pound general-purpose bombs. In the spring and summer of 1943, 60,000 tons of bombs were dropped on Germany's industrial heartland. The cost to Bomber Command was appallingly high. 872 bombers were lost.
A bombing run was perhaps the time when you were most vulnerable, because to enable the bombs to be dropped as accurately as possible, it was necessary to fly straight and level. And whilst we were in straight and level position, of course, you were much more vulnerable to fighter attacks. The navigator would indicate that you were X minutes, 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes from the actual target, and you would then get on to straight and level, and as you approach target, open the bomb doors so that the bomb aimer could release the bombs, and from then on you were just a pair, a bomb aimer giving instructions to the pilot to make sure that you came up on a correct bombing run until he had the target in his sights and he pressed the bomb release to release the bombs. For me, it was not a particularly terrifying period, because you had a lot to concentrate on to make sure that you were flying a steady course at a steady speed at the correct height, to make sure that you dropped your bombs on the target area. In my view, it was much better to spend a couple of minutes extra over the target and doing these things properly, so that you hit the target and didn't have to go back the next night, which instead of an extra 2 minutes might mean another 4, 5 or 6 hour flight, which in my view was much more dangerous from the point of view of being shot down.
Next, Bomber Command turned its attention to the city of Hamburg. This time, with the use of window, losses were considerably lower. The RAF pressed home its attacks with tremendous ferocity. Over a period of 10 nights, 4 huge raids were mounted, with over 300 Lancasters being used on each occasion. The result was a firestorm that consumed massive areas of the city. Buoyed up by this success, Harris planned a maximum effort offensive against the German capital. Churchill approved the plans, and the Battle of Berlin began. Harris predicted that obliterating Berlin would cost between 400 and 500 bombers, but he believed it would cost Germany the war. On November the 18th, the first of 16 major raids was unleashed. These would continue over the next 4.5 months. On some nights, as many as 890 aircraft took part, around 500 of them being Lancasters. The effect on the ground, however, was less than had been hoped. Berlin was substantially bigger than Hamburg, and consequently the attacks couldn't be as concentrated. Bad weather, Bomber Command's other commitments and limited resources meant that the attacks were very protracted, allowing Berlin to recover between raids. Added to this, the restructuring and the improved efficiency of German night fighter defences took a heavy toll. 517 aircraft were lost, 394 of which were Lancasters. Berlin had not been smashed, and neither had the spirit of its people.
Being coned in the searchlight, I suppose, was one of the worst things that could happen to you, because you felt as if you were the only person on the raid, that every gun in the area and every fighter was being concentrated on you. And of course it was like daylight in the aircraft, and it was very difficult that if you did take any very evasive manoeuvre as you turned the aircraft onto its side, then of course you got the full blast of searchlight into your face, and therefore you were partially blinded. One of the tricks that I understand that some people employed was that if they were coned in searchlights and they were not managing to get out, if they saw another aircraft above them, then if they flew directly underneath that aircraft, so that at one time the searchlights had two aircraft, if they continued their turn, there was a 50-50 chance that the aircraft which remained in the searchlight was the one they'd flown underneath and not themselves. Whether this was a very common practice or not, I do not know, but I do know that people talked of carrying out that manoeuvre to save their own skin.
We had on one occasion after we'd released a bomb load, we got into a storm cloud and we tried to climb over it. And we got up to something like 27,000 feet, which is about as high as a Lanc would go, even unloaded. And we were still having problems icing. And I remember noting that the outside temperature was minus 48 degrees, which is quite cold. And at that point, the entire instrument panel, everything inside the cockpit was covered in rime frost. Even your clothing would get the rime frost all over it. You were obviously wearing an oxygen mask all the time, right from takeoff back to landing. And it was surprising how much perspiration and condensation collected up in them. And you used to sort of take them by the bottom and just tip them, and you could literally tip the moisture out of it. And the gunners in their turrets, the rear gunner particularly, was very exposed, and you would often pick out the rear gunner if he'd had a particularly cold trip. The oxygen mask would have frozen to his face, and when he took it off it would peel little bits of skin off. Very, very cold job. Thankless job really, and very, well, certainly the coldest and most uncomfortable position in the kite, because these chaps went into the turrets before they took off, and they seldom if ever came out until they landed back, and that could be 7, 8, 9 hours at a stretch.
June the 6th, 1944. D-Day marked the beginning of the Allies' long-awaited counter-offensive in Europe. To support ground forces, Bomber Command unleashed an aerial assault on an unprecedented scale. Daylight raids were now possible because strategic targets were in range of fighter escorts. Attacks were made on German troop concentrations, arms dumps and communications links. Lancaster 3s equipped with Barnes-Wallis's 11,000-pound tallboy blockbusters bombed hardened German U-boat pens at Le Havre. The German battleship the Tirpitz was attacked on several occasions by Lancasters until on November the 12th, 1944, a combined force from numbers 9 and 617 squadrons found the battleship in Tromsø Fjord, Norway. The pride of the German fleet took a direct hit from a tallboy and sank. The ultimate in conventional high-explosive bombs was reached with the 22,000-pound Grand Slam. This was a weapon designed to penetrate concrete and explode 30 feet beneath the surface, causing a local earthquake. Number 617 Squadron first used the Grand Slam operationally against the Bielefeld Viaduct on March the 14th, 1945, causing considerable destruction amongst its spans. This bomb was so big that it could not be housed internally. It was slung underneath and supported by a specially designed electrical release mechanism.
The first appearance of 10-ton Tessie was at Bielefeld Viaduct. This carried a vital rail route into the Ruhr. After a few smaller bombs, the monster went down. A feature of the big bomb is the crater it makes before it goes off. Watch the left-hand corner of the white puff of smoke. The bomb makes its crater, and then and here is the result. Although not a direct hit, many yards of the viaduct have been destroyed. The Nazi world is in ruins.
A month earlier, on February the 13th, Harris's carpet bombing offensive against cities was resumed. He still believed that the demoralization of the German people was the key to an early surrender. That night, Dresden was the target of 769 Lancasters split into two waves. In total, the aircraft dropped 1,478 tons of high explosive and 1,182 tons of incendiaries. The result was a firestorm more devastating than that which had swept Hamburg 6 months before. With the benefit of hindsight, this has become one of the most controversial raids of the war. Tens of thousands of civilians lost their lives, including many thousands of refugees. It is difficult to establish whether this had any effect on accelerating the end of the war. In fact, Germany surrendered 11 weeks later. It would be fair to say, however, that the strategic bombing campaign as a whole had a profound effect on the outcome. The systematic destruction of Germany's industrial heartland forced the dispersal of arms manufacture. The subsequent smashing of Germany's road and rail links, however, foiled this policy. The Lancaster offensive against Hitler's synthetic oil plants eventually caused the grounding of the Luftwaffe for want of fuel. Statistics show that at least 59 Bomber Command squadrons operated Lancasters, which flew more than 156,000 sorties, dropped 608,612 tons of high explosives and more than 51 million incendiaries. The last Lancaster sorties of the war, however, were not to drop bombs. These were codenamed Operation Manna.
Holland was starving. There were no cats left to kill. Even the dustbins were empty. But in a few days, Bomber Command dropped over 2,000 tons of food, and the immediate crisis was past.
When I fly around these days, especially in Lincolnshire, it strikes me that not all that many things have changed since the aircraft flew around in the war. And obviously, when we fly around, we're the only Lanc there, but you're trying to think of the idea of, with all the airfields around this area in Lincolnshire, all the other Lancs flying around as well, and the fact that you must nearly always be able to see other Lancs somewhere in the sky. It's one thing we don't do, but of course on the ground, many of the ground features are just the same. Some of the old airfields are still there, you can still see them. And often we fly past Lincoln Cathedral, which is one of the landmarks, which was obviously very poignant for guys in the war. And the coastline hasn't changed much, the wash is still the same, much the same. And people often ask me if it does feel the same as if flying in the war, and of course, to me, the situation is very different. I've got no fear of being shot at, I've got no fear of the weather because we never fly in bad conditions. And the only sort of slight nagging doubt in the back of my mind is trying to carry off a presentable landing at the arrival point. I can't help but think, you know, it's such a great honour for me and sort of very humbling really, because I get to fly it in such a nice, convenient and comfortable situation with the guarantee of a nice warm bed at the end of the day, either in a hotel or at home. Always sure of getting home.
The Lancaster, in my view, was the best of the 4-engine aircraft. It was a bomber designed to do a specific job, which it did extremely well, and helped in no small measure in the ultimate victory of the Allies.